What would you do if the only thing left to your name was a battered wooden crate no bigger than a footlocker, sold at a county auction for the price of a cup of coffee and a sandwich? For Ellie Prescott, 19 years old, freshly turned out of the only house she had ever called home, this wasn't a hypothetical. It was Tuesday morning in the fall of 1953, and the crate, army issue, stenciled in faded white paint, the numbers half-eaten by damp, cost her exactly $5. The auctioneer laughed when she raised her hand. The men in the back row laughed harder. A war surplus box, water-stained and warped, listed on the ledger as contents unknown, presumed empty. Everyone in that dusty barn outside Cold Spring, Montana, agreed she had thrown away $5 she couldn't spare. But inside that crate, sealed under a false bottom she wouldn't find for another 9 days, lay something the United States Army had officially declared never recovered in the spring of 1945, a secret that would rewrite one family's grief, restore a debt owed to 11 dead men, and quietly return a young woman to a place in the world she had been told she did not deserve. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ellie Prescott had been raised, from the age of 6, by her grandfather, Amos Prescott, in a 2-room clapboard house at the end of a rutted road 3 miles outside town. Her mother had died of pneumonia the winter Ellie turned 5, and her father, well, her father was a name on a telegram, a soldier lost somewhere in the Ardennes in the last cold winter of the war, buried under a white cross in a country she had never seen. Amos took her in without a word of complaint. He was 62 years old that spring, a widower, a cabinet maker by trade, and he treated the sudden arrival of a small girl in his workshop the way he treated a stubborn knot in a piece of black walnut, with patience, with steady hands, and with the quiet conviction that beauty was inside the thing if you were willing to work for it. He taught her the craft. Not gently, not as a hobby, but the way a man teaches something he believes will outlive him. By 8, she could tell white oak from red oak by the ray fleck alone. By 10, she could cut a dovetail joint that would hold water. By 12, she was hand-planing the tops of jewelry boxes and hall tables that Amos sold to the summer people from Bozeman and Billings. He taught her the names of the tools the way other grandfathers taught prayers: the block plane, the shoulder plane, the marking gauge, the fine-toothed dovetail saw with the brass back that his own father had carried west from Ohio in 1889. He taught her to listen to wood, to tap a board and hear the difference between sound grain and a hidden void. The wood tells you where it's hollow, girl, he would say, tapping with one gnarled knuckle. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. On her 16th birthday, he gave her a small marking gauge, no bigger than her hand, its beam of rosewood, its fence of brass, its steel pin sharpened to a needle. He had made it himself, 40 years before, as his journeyman's piece. Her initials, EP, were burned into the underside of the fence in his own careful hand. She wore it in a leather sheath on her belt every day, from that morning forward. She wore it the day he died. Amos Prescott went in his sleep in the winter of 1952, quietly, the way he had done most things. Ellie was 18. The house, it turned out, had been mortgaged twice against her grandfather's final illness, a lung sickness that had eaten his savings before it took his breath. The bank took the house. The workshop was sold at auction, along with the lathe, the 2 workbenches, and the walnut planks Amos had been drying for 6 years for a project he never named. Ellie was left with a single carpetbag of clothing, the marking gauge on her belt, and a letter from her only living relative, her father's older brother, Harlan Prescott, of Cold Spring, Montana, who wrote that he was, of course, prepared to do his Christian duty by his brother's orphaned girl. Harlan Prescott owned the feed store, the grain elevator, and a small interest in the bank. He was 51, unmarried, with hands that had never held a chisel and a mouth that turned down at the corners as though tasting something sour. He installed Ellie in a narrow room above the feed store, next to the seed bins, and put her to work, sweeping the store, keeping the ledger, delivering sacks of oats to the farmers who came in on Saturdays. He did not raise his voice at her. He did not need to. He measured every kindness in cents. When she asked, once, if she might set up a small bench in the storeroom to keep her hands in the trade her grandfather had taught her, he looked at her over the tops of his half-glasses and said, "Wood is a hobby, Eleanor. Not a living. Not for a girl." He never called her Ellie. He called her Eleanor, or, more often, the girl. For 9 months she kept the ledgers of a man who did not love her, and slept on a cot above bins of winter wheat, and touched the marking gauge on her belt sometimes at night when the mice moved in the walls and the loneliness moved in her chest. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1953, Harlan called her into the small back office behind the feed store, where a green-shaded lamp burned even at 10 in the morning, and where an open ledger lay across his desk like a verdict. He did not ask her to sit. He turned the ledger toward her and tapped a column with one clean fingernail. I have been more than generous, Eleanor. Room. Board. 9 months of wages figured against your keep. The figures were in his own hand, small and neat and merciless. Her wages, at $8 a week, came to $288. Her keep, room, board, sundries, a winter coat provided in December, came to $274. The remainder, he said, tapping again, was $14. He counted it out in front of her, a 10, 3 ones, and 4 quarters, laid on the desk in a small, exact pile. I've written you a character, he said, sliding a folded sheet across the desk. The 11 o'clock stage leaves for Miles City. There is honest work there for a girl who does not put on airs. He closed the ledger. He did not look up. Ellie did not argue. She had learned, from Amos, that a piece of wood you cannot save you do not waste tears on. You set it aside, and you move on to the piece you can. She took the $14. She took the folded character. She went upstairs and packed the carpetbag, 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, a comb, a Bible with her mother's name on the flyleaf, a photograph of Amos in his workshop apron, and, at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a scrap of blue felt, the small rosewood marking gauge with EP burned into the brass. She walked down the outside stairs, past the seed bins, and out into the raw October wind. The 11 o'clock stage was, in truth, a converted Ford truck with wooden benches under canvas top, driven by a man named Sully who chewed tobacco and did not speak until spoken to. Ellie did not spend her money on Miles City. She spent 75 cents on the shorter run, 28 miles north, up into the folded country under the Bull Mountains, to a fading town called Cold Spring Junction. She had seen a notice tacked to the wall of the feed store the week before, from the county sheriff's office in the junction, an auction of unclaimed goods, seized for back storage fees, to be held on the morning of October 20th. She did not know what would be there. She only knew that she had $13.25 left in the pocket of her coat, and that she was not going to spend it on a boarding house in a city where she knew no one. The stage rattled north for 4 hours. The settled farmland gave way to sagebrush, and the sagebrush gave way to broken country, red rock and yellow grass, the sky enormous and pale. Cold Spring Junction, when they arrived, was one street of false-fronted buildings, a rail siding gone to rust, and a livery barn whose big double doors stood open on the day of the sale. Sully spat over the side of the truck. "You got people here, miss." She said she did not. He looked at her a long moment. "Auctions in the barn. Watch your money." He drove off north without another word. The auction was held by a county clerk named Whitcomb, a thin man with a bad cough, who read from a mimeographed list. There were tools and traps and a broken kitchen stove. There was a saddle no one wanted. And there was, at the very end of the list, a lot marked simply War Department storage, 1 crate, contents unknown, presumed empty. Whitcomb held up the crate, Army issue, pine, banded in iron, about 30 inches long and 18 inches deep and 18 high, water-stained black along the bottom, its stenciled numbers half gone. "Boys," he said, "this here come off the siding in 1946. Been in the shed 7 years. Nobody's claimed it. Storage bills up. What am I bid?" A man in the back row shouted, "2 bits for the box, Whitcomb, and burn what's in it." There was laughter. Ellie raised her hand and said, quietly, $5. The laughter got louder. But nobody bid against her. Whitcomb, coughing into his fist, brought his gavel down on the edge of a barrel. "Sold. To the young lady. For $5 cash." A man near the door, heavyset, in a good wool coat, with a signet ring on his little finger, turned his head sharply and looked at her for the first time. His name, she would learn later, was Silas Doone, and he owned half the buildings on the one street of Cold Spring Junction. He watched her carry the crate out into the sun as though she had walked off with something that belonged to him. She rented a room, that first night, at the widow Halloran's boarding house at the north end of the street, 50 cents a night, breakfast included, with the understanding that she would help with the dishes. Mrs. Halloran was 64, red-cheeked, widowed twice, and asked no questions. Ellie paid for 3 nights in advance, $1.50, and carried the crate up the narrow back stairs to a small room under the eaves with a bed, a washstand, and one window that looked out on the rail siding. She did not open the crate that night. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hand on the lid, and she felt, for the first time in 9 months, that she was in a room that belonged, for that hour, to her. The next morning she began. She had, in the pocket of her coat, a small awl and a folding rule, in the carpet bag, the marking gauge. She did not have a pry bar. She went down to the widow Halloran's kitchen and asked, politely, if there was such a thing in the shed. There was. It was rusted, but sound. She carried it upstairs and set about the crate the way Amos had taught her to set about any closed box, slowly, from the seams outward, listening for the wood. The iron banding had corroded onto the pine. She soaked it in vinegar from Mrs. Halloran's kitchen, borrowed the widow's kettle for hot water, and worked the strapping loose one nail at a time. It took her the whole of the first day to get the lid off. Her hands, by evening, were black with rust and split at the knuckles. Inside the crate, at first, was nothing extraordinary. A layer of tarred canvas, cracked with age. Under the canvas, a stack of manila folders bound with red tape, Army quartermaster records, requisitions, mimeographed orders from a base she did not recognize. Under the folders, 2 mess kits, dented. A folded wool blanket, moth-eaten. A tin of shoe polish. A pair of officers' dress gloves, 1 glove missing. A canvas map case, empty. And, at the bottom, a layer of sawdust and wood shavings, as though something had been packed for shipment and then, at the last, removed. Ellie sat back on her heels and looked at it and understood, with a small hot lurch in her chest, why no one had bid against her. The crate was, as the ledger had said, effectively empty. She had spent $5 of her $14 on army trash. She did not cry. She swept the shavings into a paper sack. She folded the blanket. She sorted the papers. And she went downstairs and asked Mrs. Halloran if the widow knew of any work in the town for a girl who could keep a ledger and mend a chair. Mrs. Halloran looked her over and said, "You mend chairs, child." Ellie said she did. The widow said there was a Windsor in the parlor with a cracked stretcher that had defeated 3 men. Ellie fixed it that afternoon, using hide glue warmed on the kitchen stove and a clamp fashioned from a bit of clothesline and a stick, a trick of Amos's she had not thought of in years. Mrs. Halloran watched her work in silence, and when the chair was done, and rocking easily on its 4 legs again, the widow said, "You'll stay a week for the price of 3 nights, and I'll spread the word." That was how the town began, quietly, to know her. By the end of that first week she had mended a rocker for the blacksmith's wife, rehung a warped door at the Methodist church, and patched the split seat of a buckboard for a rancher named Coburn who paid her in a side of bacon and $2. She was still, in the town's eyes, the odd girl who had bought the empty crate. Silas Doone, the man with the signet ring, walked into the widow Halloran's parlor on the 4th evening, hat in hand, and offered Ellie $7 for the crate and its contents as a curiosity, you understand, for my office. $7 was 2 nights' lodging and a week of meals. She looked at his hand on the brim of his hat, at the 2 clean fingernails, at the way his eyes moved once, quickly, to the stairs that led up to her room. She said, very politely, that the crate was not for sale. He smiled without warmth and said, "Everything is for sale, Miss Prescott. Only the price changes." He set his hat on his head and left. Mrs. Halloran, in the doorway, watched him go and said, quietly, "That man does not offer $7 for a curiosity, child. You listen to me. You keep that box." Ellie kept it. It was on her 9th night in Cold Spring Junction that she met the old-timer. His name was Elias Boone, no relation, he was quick to say, to Silas Doone, though the names sounded alike enough that the town joke was that God had run short on syllables in this county. Elias was 79. He had been, in his time, a mule packer for the army out of Fort Keogh, and he still walked with the rolling gait of a man who had spent 40 years alongside animals. He came into the widow's kitchen for his weekly bowl of stew, sat across from Ellie at the long pine table, and looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You're the girl bought Sergeant Ross's box," he said. It was not a question. Ellie put down her spoon. She said she had bought a crate. She did not know whose it had been. Elias set down his cup. "Boxes remember, girl. Wood remembers. Man packs a thing careful, the wood knows why. You listen to the wood, you'll know why too." Then he ate his stew, and he tipped his hat to the widow, and he walked out into the cold. Ellie sat at the table a long time after he had gone. She went back up to her room that night and looked at the crate again. She had emptied it. She had, she thought, examined it. But she had not, in the way Amos had taught her, listened to it. She lit the kerosene lamp, set it on the washstand, and knelt on the floor beside the crate with her ear near the wood. She tapped along the bottom with one knuckle, slow, the way her grandfather had taught her to tap along a suspect board. The sound was even, and then, 3 inches from the front edge, dull. She tapped again. Dull. She moved along the bottom, tapping. The whole front third of the crate's floor gave back a duller sound than the back 2/3. She sat up on her heels. Her heart was moving in her chest in a way she had not felt since the morning Amos died. She pulled the marking gauge from her belt. The wood tells you where it's hollow, girl. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. She measured the inside depth of the crate from the top lip to the floor. Then she went outside, into the cold, with the lamp shielded by her coat, and she measured the outside depth from the top lip to the bottom of the iron banding. The inside was 17 1/4 inches. The outside was 19 3/4. The floor of the crate, the piece of pine she had thought was the bottom, was 2.5 inches shy of where the bottom of the crate actually was. She had, all along, been looking at a false floor. She could have pried it up in 5 minutes with the widow's rusty crowbar. She did not. She spent the next 3 hours doing it the way Amos would have done it, carefully, so as not to split the pine, so as not to break whatever might be beneath. She used the marking gauge to score a fine line 1/8 of an inch from the crate's inside walls on all 4 sides. She used the awl to find the wire brads that pinned the false floor down, 7 of them, hand-set, driven from below. She worked each brad up with the awl and a small hammer borrowed from the blacksmith's boy, whom she paid in a peppermint. When the last brad was loose, she slid the marking gauge under the edge of the false floor and lifted, gently, with both hands. The board came up whole. She set it aside. She held the lamp over the space beneath. The space beneath the false floor of Sergeant Ross's army crate measured 29 1/2 inches long, 17 1/4 inches wide, and 2 3/8 inches deep. In that space, laid in careful rows on a bed of sawdust and oiled paper, were the following items, which Ellie removed one at a time and set on the Widow Halloran's braided rug and counted twice to be sure to 84 $20 gold pieces, United States coinage, dated between 1904 and 1928, wrapped in bundles of 12 in oiled paper. That was $1,680 in gold, at face, and she would learn, later, from a dealer in Billings, closer to $11,000 in 1953 money at the melt, and more still to a collector. Beneath the coins, a leather paymaster's wallet, cracked at the seams, containing $462 in old Army scrip, some of it from a series discontinued in 1934. Beneath the wallet, a small ledger book in a waterproof oilskin, listing 11 names in a careful hand, with sums beside each name totaling $3,240, pay owed, she would come to understand, to 11 men. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in a scrap of blue flannel that made her breath catch in her throat because it was the same blue as the scrap she used to wrap her marking gauge, a small carved wooden bird, a meadowlark, no bigger than her thumb, its feathers scored in fine lines by a maker's knife, its eye a pinprick of black paint. And beneath the bird, in a sealed oilskin envelope, a letter. The envelope was addressed, in a strong, tired hand, to whoever finds this, please read all the way through. Ellie sat on the widow's rug with the lamp on the floor beside her, and she opened the letter, and she read it. My name is Sergeant Thomas J. Ross, of the Quartermaster Corps, formerly attached to the 762nd Transport Battalion, U.S. Army. If you are reading this, then I did not come back for this box, and I ask your patience for the length of what I have to say. In the spring of 1945, in the last weeks of the war in Europe, our detachment was ordered to move a payroll of $47,000 in gold, scrip, and coin from a railhead in eastern France to a forward pay station near the Rhine. There were 12 of us in the detail, under my command. We were ambushed on the morning of the 4th of April by a party of stragglers, deserters, ours and theirs both. The war had gone strange by then, in the woods above a village whose name I will not write here because there are still men living who would be shamed by it. Of the 12 of us, 11 were killed. I was the 12th. I was left for dead with a bullet through my shoulder and another through my thigh, and I lay in the wet leaves for a day and a half before a farm woman found me and hid me in her barn. The payroll was gone. Most of it. The men who ambushed us took what they could carry on their backs and left the rest scattered in the leaves, a strong box they could not open, 3 sacks of coin they could not lift. When I could stand, and with the help of that woman, whose name was Margaret and whose kindness I will not describe here because it would take pages, I gathered what I could find of the payroll. $1,680 in double eagles. $462 in scrip. It was not the whole of what was lost. It was what I could carry. I was 3 months getting back to our lines. By then the war was over. The army had listed the payroll as never recovered and my detail as killed in action to a man. I let them go on believing it about me for a while, because there were things I needed to do first. I needed to write down, from memory, the names of my 11 men, and what each of them was owed in back pay at the moment of his death, so that if I did not survive the journey home, someone might one day pay their people what the army had failed to pay. That ledger is in this box. Those debts are real. I came home in the fall of 1945. I found that my wife, Sarah, whom I had married in 1938, had died in the winter of 1944 of a fever, and that our son, Thomas Jr., who was 5 years old and whom I had seen only twice in his short life, had been sent to my wife's sister in Idaho and had died the following spring of the same fever. I have in this box a wooden bird I carved for him on the troopship going over. He never held it. I could not bring myself to bury it with him because I had not been there to bury him. I was, when I came home, 41 years old, a widower, a childless father, and the only surviving witness to the deaths of 11 good men whose pay the army had written off as lost. I decided 2 things. The first was that I would not turn the gold into the army, because the army had already decided the gold did not exist, and because I did not trust the men in the pay office to see the 11 families paid what they were owed. The second was that I would carry the gold and the scrip and the ledger and the bird west with me, and I would find honest work, and I would, over the years, pay the 11 families what the army had not paid them, quietly, in envelopes with no return address, until the ledger was clear. I got as far as Cold Spring Junction, Montana, in the winter of 1946, on my way to a job at a sawmill in the Bull Mountains. I paid 9 of the 11 families out of the scrip and a portion of the coin before the winter of 1947. I am writing this on the 11th of February of that year. I have 2 families left to pay. The Kowalskis of Hamtramck, Michigan, owed $318, and the widow Beatrice Hensley of Roanoke, Virginia, owed $290. I have set this crate at the rail siding to be shipped to a friend in Billings who will hold it for me until I return from a doctor in Miles City who has told me my lungs are not good. The same wet leaves, I suppose, that saved me have caught up with me at last. If you are reading this, I did not return from Miles City. I ask of you, whoever you are, 3 things. First, see that the Kowalskis of Hamtramck and the widow Hensley of Roanoke are paid what they are owed, out of the coin in this box. Their addresses are in the back of the ledger. Send it as a stranger would, with no explanation beyond, a debt of the army, from a friend of your son's, or from a friend of your husband's. Do not put your name to it. They have grieved enough without being asked to grieve a stranger too. Second, what remains of the coin and the scrip after those 2 debts are paid is yours. I mean this. I have no one. You found what 11 men and 1 tired sergeant could not carry home. Use it well. Do not spend it on things that rot. Build something that will still be standing when you are as old as I am now. Third, and last, keep the bird. I carved it for a boy I never got to know. If you have a use for a small wooden bird, if there is a child in your life, or if there is not and you only need something small and made by hand to remind you that a man can love a person he never met, then it is yours. I would rather it sat on your windowsill than in the dark of this crate. I was 43 years old on the day I sealed this letter. My name was Thomas J. Ross. My wife was Sarah. My son was Thomas. Do not mourn us. Make something live again. Yours in trust, Sergeant T. J. Ross, USA, 762nd Transport Battalion. Ellie set the letter down on the widow Halloran's braided rug. She sat for a long time with her hands in her lap. Then she folded the letter carefully back into its oilskin envelope, and she picked up the small wooden meadowlark, and she held it in her palm, and she did not cry. She thought of Amos, and of the marking gauge on her belt, and of the 11 names in the ledger, and of a boy in Idaho who had died of a fever in the spring of 1945 without ever holding the bird his father had carved for him on a troopship. And she made her 3 decisions, in the order Sergeant Ross had asked. The next morning she went to the widow Halloran's kitchen and asked, quietly, whether the widow could keep a secret. Mrs. Halloran, drying a plate, said she had kept 2 husbands' secrets and could keep a 3rd. Ellie told her. She showed her the letter. Mrs. Halloran sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, and did not speak for a full minute. Then she said, "Child, you do exactly what that man asked. And you do it from my kitchen, and you do it with my postbox, and you do not put your name on one envelope." That was how it began. Ellie took the ledger and the 2 remaining addresses to the post office in Cold Spring Junction the following Monday. She purchased 2 postal money orders, one for $318, made out to Mr. and Mrs. Stanislaw Kowalski of Hamtramck, Michigan, and one for $290, made out to Mrs. Beatrice Hensley of Roanoke, Virginia. She paid the small fees out of her own pocket. She enclosed, with each, a single line in her own hand, "A debt of the army, from a friend of your son. A debt of the army, from a friend of your husband." She did not sign either note. She mailed them on a Monday, and she walked back to the widow's boarding house, and she felt, for the first time since Amos died, that she had done a thing that mattered. What remained, after those 2 debts, was the greater part of the gold and a portion of the scrip and every one of Sergeant Ross's instructions about what not to do with it. Do not spend it on things that rot. Build something that will still be standing when you are as old as I am now. Ellie was 19. She had a marking gauge on her belt and a carved bird on her windowsill and a room under the eaves of the widow Halloran's boarding house. She thought about what Amos would have done. She thought about what Thomas Ross would have done. And she went, on the following Saturday morning, to look at a building. There was, on the south end of the 1 street of Cold Spring Junction, an empty carpentry shop that had belonged to a man named Halsey who had died in 1949 and whose heirs had let it fall to tax. The building was sound in its bones, a false-fronted timber structure with a good stone foundation and a shingled roof that had only 2 soft places. Silas Doone held the tax lien. He had been sitting on it for 4 years, waiting to buy the lot for the price of the taxes and put up a bigger feed store to compete with a rival across the county. The taxes owed were $480. Ellie walked into the county clerk's office on a Monday morning, laid $480 in old gold coin on Whitcomb's desk, and asked to redeem the lien in her own name. Whitcomb, who had sold her the crate for $5 9 weeks before, looked at the gold and then at her face and then at the gold again, and he coughed once into his fist, and he wrote out the receipt without a word. The town, of course, talked. A girl of 19, buying a dead man's carpentry shop with gold coin, out of a crate everyone had seen her carry off for the price of a sandwich. Silas Doone came to the widow Halloran's parlor that same evening, and this time his smile had teeth in it. He said he was prepared to offer her $400, cash, for the shop, above what she had paid, as a favor, Miss Prescott, to keep the girl out of a trade that will grind her down. Ellie stood in the parlor doorway with the marking gauge on her belt, and she looked at him and she said, quietly, "The shop is not for sale, Mr. Doone. Only the price changes." Mrs. Halloran, at the sideboard, coughed into her hand in a way that sounded very much like a laugh. Silas Doone left, and did not come back. By the end of that first winter, Ellie had reopened Halsey's shop under a hand-painted sign that read, simply, Prescott and Ross, Cabinet Makers. The second name on the sign was a puzzle to the town for the first month. She let it be a puzzle. She hired, in January, a 58-year-old carpenter named Bill Coburn, the same rancher whose buckboard she had patched, who had lost his own place to the bank the year before and had been drinking himself quietly toward the grave in the back room of the livery, and she paid him $1.50 a day and coffee at noon. He did not thank her in words. He came in the next morning at 6 and swept out the shop before she arrived. That was his thanks. She hired, in February, the blacksmith's boy, the same boy she had paid in a peppermint, as an apprentice at $4 a week, and she began to teach him what Amos had taught her, the block plane first, then the marking gauge, then the sound of a hollow board. She hired, in March, a young widow named Ruth Ackley, whose husband had died in a mine accident up at Roundup, to keep the books and to sew the felt linings for the jewelry boxes she began to build. Ruth's son, 4 years old, sat on a stool in the corner of the shop and played with a small carved wooden bird that Ellie had lent him for the afternoon and that he had, by the end of the day, refused to give back. Ellie let him keep it. She had realized, other work to do than to sit alone in her room with a dead man's grief on her windowsill. The reckoning, when it came, was quiet, the way Sergeant Ross's letter had been quiet. Word travels, in a country of 1 street and 1 stage road, and word traveled south to Cold Spring proper in the spring of 1954, and word reached Harlan Prescott in his back office behind the feed store, under his green-shaded lamp, and Harlan came north on the 11 o'clock stage on a Tuesday morning in April. Exactly 6 months after he had counted out $14 on his desk and told his brother's daughter that there was honest work in Miles City for a girl who did not put on airs. He did not come into the shop. He stood across the street for a long time, in his Goodwill coat, and he looked at the sign, Prescott and Ross, and he looked at the 2 wagons drawn up at the loading door for pickup, and he looked at Bill Coburn carrying a finished blanket chest out to a buyer from Billings, and Harlan Prescott's face did a thing Ellie saw through the window and did not entirely understand until later. It was not anger. It was the face of a man who has, in the closing of a ledger, made an error of arithmetic he cannot now go back and correct. He stood there 20 minutes. Then he turned around and he walked back to the stage office and he took the 2 o'clock south, and Ellie never saw him again in her life. He died, she heard later, in 1959, of a stroke, in the room behind the feed store, alone. He left the feed store to a cousin in Great Falls. He did not leave her a line. By the fall of 1954, 1 year almost to the day from the morning she had raised her hand for a $5 crate in a dusty barn, Ellie Prescott's shop was building furniture for buyers as far as Bozeman and Billings and, once, for a hotel in Sheridan, Wyoming. She had 4 people on her payroll. She had a small apartment above the shop with a window that looked east into the Bull Mountains and a windowsill on which sat a carved wooden meadowlark no bigger than her thumb. She had a coffee ritual. Bill Coburn brought a fresh pot in from the wood stove at 10 every morning, and the 4 of them, Ellie and Bill and the blacksmith's boy and Ruth Ackley, drank a cup together standing up, in the sawdust, before going back to their benches. She had a delivery ritual. Every Friday afternoon, she walked a covered dish of Mrs. Halloran's stew down the street to Elias Boone, the old mule packer, who was 80 now and living alone above the livery, and she sat with him for half an hour and let him tell her stories about Fort Keogh in the 1890s, and once, only once, he looked at her over the rim of his cup and said, "You listen to the wood, girl." She did not ask him how he had known. She had come to understand that some old men know things the way old wood knows things, because they have been quiet long enough to hear. She had, that fall, one last piece of business from the letter, and she did it on a clear cold evening in October, on the anniversary of the auction. She walked out past the rail siding, past the last of the town's lights, up onto a low rise of yellow grass under an enormous sky, and she carried with her 2 small objects wrapped separately in blue felt. She unwrapped them and held them side by side in her palm under the last of the light. In her right hand, the small rosewood marking gauge with EP burned into the brass, her grandfather's journeyman's piece, 41 years old that fall, given to a girl on her 16th birthday by a man who had taught her to listen to wood. In her left hand, the carved wooden meadowlark, no bigger than her thumb, carved on a troopship in the winter of 1944 by a man she had never met, for a boy who had died before he could hold it. She thought about what each of the 2 men had given her. Amos had given her a trade, the block plane and the marking gauge and the sound of a hollow board and the patience to work a piece of wood the way a piece of wood asks to be worked. Thomas Ross had given her a purpose, 11 names in a ledger, and 2 envelopes mailed from a widow's postbox, and a shop with 2 names over the door, and a small carved bird to remind her that a man can love a person he never met. One had taught her how to build. The other had taught her what to build for. She was 19 years old, and she had been cast out with $14 to her name, and she had bought a warped army crate at a county auction for $5, and she had listened to the wood, and the wood had told her where it was hollow, and inside the hollow she had found 84 gold coins and $462 in old scrip and 11 names and a wooden bird and a letter from a dead sergeant who had asked her to make something live again. She had paid the Kowalskis of Hamtramck $318. She had paid the widow Hensley of Roanoke $290. She had redeemed a tax lien of $480, and she had put Prescott and Ross over a door on the south end of a one-street town in Montana, and she had, on that October evening on the rise above the rail siding, a marking gauge in one hand and a meadowlark in the other and the whole enormous sky above her turning slowly toward winter. She wrapped the 2 objects back in their blue felt. She put the gauge on her belt and the bird in her pocket. She walked back down into town in the failing light, and the lamps were coming on in the windows of the widow Halloran's boarding house and in the shop at the south end of the street where Bill Coburn was banking the wood stove for the night, and Ellie Prescott, 19 years old, went home. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of quiet debts and patient hands. If you were moved by Ellie's journey, by a girl who listened when everyone else laughed, and who built something out of what a dead man had asked her to carry, please give this video a like, and share it with someone who has ever been handed a small, exact, insulting sum of money and told to make it be enough. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale, coming soon. The story of a widow in the Nebraska sandhills who bought her husband's old railroad watch back at auction for $2 and found, inside its case, a folded slip of paper that named the man who had killed him. Until then, be well. And tell us, in the comments, what have you carried out of a hard chapter of your own life, some small object or piece of instruction that turned out to be worth more than anyone around you understood? We'll be reading. We always are.